Thank you all so much for joining us today. This is the 9th session of the Resilience Through Connection series. This ECHO is sponsored by the North Dakota Suicide Prevention Program, which is funded by the North Dakota Department of Health and Human Services Behavioral Health Division. The Resilience Through Connection ECHO aims to provide a deep exploration of the various factors that impact social connection and the predictors of loneliness. Each of our sessions are tailored with strategies to increase life skills, resilience, and foster a sense of connectedness for people with disabilities. So this includes enhancing knowledge of protective factors against suicide, emphasizing the importance of social connectedness, and also raising awareness of North Dakota resources and activities that can help people find that sense of belonging. Just a reminder, you can earn professional development credits in social work, nursing, and peer support by participating in our sessions. To receive credit for your attendance, please fill out the evaluation feedback survey that's going to be posted in the chat after the session. If you have to log off a little bit early, you can find the feedback form in iEcho by going to the Schedule tab and submit feedback button, as you can see here. And as mentioned, all of the slides are under the Content tab in iEcho. So I would love to introduce our speaker for today, Renee Carterell. She is a nonprofit leader, community organizer, and university professor. She focuses on building inclusive communities which thrive by building a collaborative environment. So please help me in welcoming Renee.
Thank you, Krista. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. Oh, except for I think I'm on the wrong slide. Let me get to the right slide first. There we go. Sorry, we were all set up. Whoops. And I forgot to move my slides back to the right screen. So here we go. Now I'm on the main slide. So I'm going to be presenting on social polarization and loneliness. And I wanted to start it off today with a quote. So this is Orson Welles. We're born alone, we live alone, we die alone. Only through our love and friendship can we create the illusion for the moment that we are not alone. And I had chosen this image of a bee because for a while in my life, I'd been told the story that a bee, when it's separated from its hive, will die in the wild because it needs its hive to survive. And I always related that to humans. I always felt like when humans were separated from their hive, from being around other humans, they didn't thrive. At best, they survived. And we can think of like Tom Hanks in the movie where he was on that island by himself, or of people who've been, live in the woods and become kind of hermits, and how they, first of all, face the dangers of not having society take care for them if they're ill, but also they just don't do well. They mentally and aren't healthy. They physically aren't healthy. And so I often think of bees and humans as having that same characteristic. Unfortunately, recently, when I was actually preparing for this, I learned that there's more solitary bees than there are hive bees in the world. In other words, not every bee belongs to a hive. So I have to get rid of that idea, but I like the picture, so I kept it. And I still think it's a good analogy that, when we as humans are separated from our hive, we really do not thrive. So I wanted to center our conversation a little today around this idea of what it means not to be part of a hive, of what it means to be lonely. And I wanted you all to reflect for a few seconds on whether or not you've experienced really true loneliness. And I don't mean being alone for a few minutes or spending the weekend on your own, or being single and not having anybody in your life, but I mean lonely. And some of you probably have never really experienced that level of loneliness. But for those of you who have, think about what was happening in your life to create that experience of loneliness. And so I'm just going to give you like 10 seconds to think about that. Okay, well, Krista introduced me a little bit, but I'm going to introduce myself a little more. So I'm Renee Carterell. I'm a descendant of English, Italian, and Scandinavian immigrants. I'm a sociologist. I have a PhD in public administration. Krista and I met in a public administration program at UND. I also am a nonprofit executive, an active grassroots organizer, a university professor, a passionate believer in compassion. And once upon a time, I was very, very lonely. And I'm going to give you a little bit of my story to explain loneliness to you as in the way that I think about it. So I was 13 when my parents separated and my family kind of broke up. Uh, my older siblings went off to live at college or other places, and my parents separated and moved to different communities, and they rented a room for me in the basement of someone's house. And I lived there for that year, 13 to 14. And then after that, I lived with my mom for a while, and then my mom and dad got back together, and I lived with them for a while. But really, by the time I was 16, I was on my own. And my dad always said I was 13 going on 30, and that I was just capable, perfectly capable of taking care of myself. And I always agreed with him. But I didn't realize the impact that loss of family had on me. And as a result, in my late teens and early 20s, I was extremely lonely. I did not feel like I belonged anywhere. I felt isolated. And during that time, I got married. So I was married. I was around people. There were people in my life. My family still was there. I could go visit them. But I felt so lonely. And looking back on it now, I can clearly see how depressed I was because of this isolation that I felt, this lack of a sense of belonging. And I remember being married and asking my husband over and over again, "Do you love me?" Because I just didn't feel loved. So when I talk about loneliness, I'm not talking about being alone. I'm talking about this internal sense of belonging, that you feel like you belong somewhere, that people care about you. And there are a lot of people in our society who do not have that sense of belonging somewhere. In fact, social psychologist Jeff Cohen says we have a crisis of belonging and that it's destroying us. Now, we all know that the Surgeon General, well, you probably have heard that the Surgeon General put out a report on loneliness and said that it's an epidemic. And we know the statistics of how it impacts our health and well-being. And the report also talked about how young people are struggling with high levels of anxiety and mental health concerns because of it. I have a daughter who's in her 20s, and she experiences a lot of social anxiety, feeling like she doesn't fit in. In my family, we have a lot of neurodiversity, and so that's another common thing is, even though you're raised in the culture that is all around you, you don't ever really feel like you fit into that culture. You don't feel like you belong. So we're seeing this increase where people are not feeling like they belong anywhere, and they feel very isolated. This sense of isolation, of not belonging, also creates division and hate and polarization. So that was the topic of the talk today is how loneliness is tied to polarization. And I want to talk about how our culture systemically has been kind of crafted in a way that drives this sense of loneliness in people, this sense that they don't belong. And part of it is that many of us don't really do a great job of recognizing when other people are feeling lonely and disconnected. We think if they're surrounded by people that they're okay. We think that if they're feeling lonely, they should just go out and be around friends. But I'm going to take you back to that young woman I was who was married and still felt so alone. Even though I was married, even though I had colleagues and friends, I still just did not feel like I belonged somewhere. So it's not a solution just to suggest to people that they get out and be around people, because that doesn't really just solve this deep sense of not belonging. And in fact, a lot of times in our communities, when we do that, when we just kind of tell people they should just, come out and be with others, a lot of times we reinforce that sense of isolation. And sometimes in our actions, we even threaten people's sense of belonging and drive them even further away. And many of us don't recognize when we're doing that. And so to give you an example to help you understand how that might work, I'm going to talk a little bit about Midwest nice. So I grew up in Minnesota, so I might end up saying Minnesota nice. But this idea, this concept of we're nice to each other's faces, but there's nothing substantial behind it. I actually think Midwest nice is a good quality to have. I think we need peaceful communities where people are around each other and not fighting and bickering, where they have an opportunity to interact and be friendly with each other, where you don't walk out your door and feel threatened by other people or attacked by other people. So I think that's a good quality. But what Midwest Nice also does is perpetuate a sense of in-group and out-group because it lacks a lot of substance behind it. So you go to work, you have colleagues who are nice to your face, but they don't have anything beyond that. They don't invite you to their homes. They might go to lunch with you when you're at work, but they don't invite you to participate in their lives in a more deep way. They go to the cabin on the weekends and spend their weekends with their families. They have a nice in-group. They spend their time with their in-group, whether it's their family or their college friends or their high school friends. They have their in-group. And if you were not part of that in-group originally, you might not feel connected to them, even if they do have lunch with you occasionally. So going back to when I was young and isolated and alone and lonely, I would go to work or I would go to my community. I had small children. I'd go to the ECFE, the Early Childhood Education Centers, and I would talk to the woman there and they'd be very friendly to me. And then they'd go off together and I'd hear them talking about visiting each other's houses on the weekends and spending time together outside of ECFE. And I was never invited into that. I did not ever feel this sense of belonging to the community because people were not really welcoming me in. They were not creating a sense of belonging for me. And that's that Midwest nice is a part of our culture that highlights how we drive this, how our culture is driving this sense of disconnection that a lot of people are feeling. Many of you know Robin Williams. He was an actor and a comedian. He completed suicide a few years ago. He had a lot of depression and he was alone. He was lonely a lot. He said, I used to think the worst thing in my life is to end up all alone. It's not. The worst thing in life is to end up with people who make you feel alone. And I think that it sums up this idea of we can be surrounded by people and still feel very lonely. When we feel like we don't belong, we become vulnerable to dangerous and ridiculous beliefs. This is Jeff Cohen um, and talking about this idea that when we don't feel like we belong somewhere, we're more subject to being pulled into other ideas, into extreme ideas. He says ridiculous. I would use the word extreme. So dangerous or extreme beliefs where we feel a sense of belonging because of those beliefs. And I'm going to give you some examples on how that works. But first, I'm going to hop over and we're going to hear a little piece of Jeff talking about this. So give me a second just to line this up to where I want to have it be at. There we go.
That we have what some call an epidemic of loneliness, wherein roughly 20%, I think, of Americans are so lonely that it poses a severe health risk as bad as smoking a pack of cigarettes a day. So on top of that, indicators of division are at a high now, such as political polarization. I think hate crimes are roughly at a 10-year high. So the markers of divisiveness, the indicators of isolation, the feeling of being left behind economically, not being part of a community or a country are great now. Also, as workplaces have kind of changed in their nature and they become less of a place where people get meaning and a sort of lifelong sense of belonging and community, phrase to communities, religious associations have opened up. Because of all that, I think it is an apt term for the era we're in. Very few groups feel confident in their sense of belonging. And groups that once did are now a bit unmoored and adrift. So I would say that. And then what the crisis of belonging implies is that it's a crisis, that this matters. Belonging isn't just a touchy-feely construct. It's actually something that, though touchy-feely, has hard consequences. It's associated with physical illness, early death, cardiovascular disease, also vulnerability. There's some exciting research to hate groups and extremist and conspiratorial thinking. When we feel like we don't belong, we become vulnerable to dangerous and ridiculous beliefs with groups that provide us that sense of belonging. So I think, though there are many things contributing to the problems that beleaguer our country now, belonging could be one like sort of underlying symptom or underlying cause that, if we address it, could have manifold benefits for our society.
Right.
Okay, that you heard that all okay, right? I can't see people, so that came across clear.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Just wanted to make sure. It sounded really faint to me at first, so I turned my volume up. So Jeff sort of points out this idea of the sense of belonging being a crisis, and how it's growing in our country, and it's leading to some of these problems that we're seeing, like the polarization that we currently have in our communities today. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about Barbie in terms of this idea of a crisis in connection. And, you know, Barbie was kind of swept through our communities, and I know a lot of people who really like Barbie. So if you like Barbie, put in the chat what you liked about Barbie. For many people, it was a really fun movie, and it really resonated with them. I did not have that experience when I watched Barbie.
Making me happy. It's doing what you need.
Yeah. So I did not have that experience with Barbie. I didn't understand it. And I struggled with why so many people were, especially a young woman, were drawn to it. And I'm in my 50s, so I'm of a different generation. And I think that has everything to do with it. Because during my generation, when I was young, I had a different experience of being female. And I read an article, and the author really highlighted for me what I think I was missing. And once I read this article, and I really recommend it, it was very interesting. Once I read this article, I started to understand why young women were drawn to this movie. And she pointed out that young women today, and I'm talking 20s, maybe early 30s, have become much more, she called it liberal, I would say empowered, much more their own person. They are much less tied to the idea of marriage as a measure of their self-worth. And during my generation, marriage was the ultimate. I was young enough. I mean, I'm at an age where when I was young, marriage was what you aspired to do when you were a woman. And if you weren't married, there was something wrong with you. And I have friends who more recently have divorced, and immediately they want to go back and get married again because they feel like they're alone. They feel like they're not worth anything if they're not married. But this author points out that a lot of young women today, not every young woman, of course, doesn't feel that way. They don't measure their self-worth by being with a man. And she used Taylor Swift as an example. She said she's a 30-year-old woman who's highly successful, who has cats, and who is happy to not be married. She doesn't have to be married to feel like she's successful. She says in response, young men are becoming more conservative, and in some cases more misogynistic or hateful of women. And she says to boys who see their fathers as arguably having had life much easier, the message of, hate is a powerful message. They see their fathers having married, they see their fathers having been successful, and they're not getting those same responses. They're not finding a woman who makes them the center of their life like their fathers did. And this is frustrating to young men. So Barbie really encapsulated that, highlighted how this divide between young women and young men are happening. And we see it in the US, but we're seeing it worldwide too. And in fact, places like China, which had the one-child rule, and for those of you who don't know how that worked, China families were only allowed to have one child for many years. And many of the families wanted a boy. So there was a lot of infanticide and abortions of female fetuses and female infants. And as a result, China is overpopulated with young men right now who have nobody to partner with. If they're heterosexual, they have no partners because there's not enough young women. So we're seeing this kind of worldwide, that there's this sort of sense of loss for young men. These young men are, and this is just an example of how this isolation, this loneliness can work, because it happens to more than just young men. But I wanted to give you this story of these young men as an example of how it's working and how it polarizes them. So many of these young men feel as though they've lost a lot of status and power, and like they don't belong anywhere. And I'm going to highlight that through this short video on, and sorry, ad's going to pop up, I think.
When I started drinking cold water
Sorry
to
about
help
the
me lose
ad.
weight, my friends laughed at me. But when they saw how fast I was changing.
Okay.
What do you think men want in women?
That's a really good question. And I can answer that one easily. I think that the masculine realm that we operate in is based on respect. I think that men are constantly looking for a way to be respected. I think the world is hyper competitive and we're constantly always looking for status amongst our peers. This is why you will see a man give up his basically entire life to do something which will only gain him respect, even in a very small sphere. There are CEOs who go to work every day and don't even see their family and give up their entire life and work 12-hour days just to feel like the man in that office. Feeling important in that one office, in that one skyscraper, is worth him giving up his life because he feels like he matters. And if he gets more respect in that office than he does at home or anywhere else, that's where he's going to want to be. Men function on that. So if I had to build the ideal woman who could get any man on earth, what she would have to do is understand that I need to give my man as much status and as much respect as possible. I, by extension of him, being next to him, need to make him look respected. And a lot of this is the easy things we know. No one's going to respect a man who's with an ultra promiscuous woman. No one's going to respect a man who's with a woman who's back-talking him or horrible to him in public. No one's going to respect a man who's with a woman who clearly isn't interested in him sexually, whatever. That's all the obvious part. But the hidden actual message behind all of it is that men are constantly looking for status and respect, and a woman who makes her man feel respected, not only from her, but from his peers, is the kind of woman a man's never going to want to lose.
Right.
So if I had a woman and I came home with all 5 of my friends and she...
Okay, I'm going to pause right there and go back to my slides. So those of you who know Andrew Tate know that he's a online blogger and broadcaster who's very popular with a group of young men who don't feel like they belong anywhere, young men who are forming online coalitions of hate. And he's considered to be a misogynist, woman hater, and a lot of people are very frustrated with Andrew Tate, but he has a huge following. And you can see in his dialogue there what he's highlighting about how young men feel. And I thought it was really interesting. He actually says, well, if I was to build a woman who could get any man that she wanted, he actually goes back to that old idea that I said my generation grew up with, that women should base their self-worth on what man they can get. And he's saying women should want to do this. They should want to measure their life by how they can get a man. And so this just highlights kind of what's going on inside this group. And so these young men who are drawn to this type of in-group are kind of caught in a vicious cycle. They're feeling very isolated, and the more isolated they feel, the more they cling to their online communities, and the more they hear the same thing and hear the same frustrations. And these aren't really addressing their emotions. They're not helping them connect to others. In fact, they're reinforcing the negative feelings they have and and leading to an even deeper connection to that community. They feel a sense of belonging to that community that's full of kind of hate and frustration and anger because they're not dealing with their emotions. Instead, they're just sort of trapped in this echo chamber. And I have one more little clip here. So let me line this one up.
There's a dangerous
Again, I
threat in
got
the
the ads.
legislature.
I
A proposed
apologize. I don't know how
loophole
not
would
to have
allow
ads on my
optometrists
YouTube.
who are not
I
medical.
think you have to pay.
One of the big things I've been worried about recently is young men and how angry they've become, how alone they've become, how isolated they've become, and then ironically, how they've turned that anger, isolation into a community. And it's weird because it's literally there's communities of young men online who have formed communities based in and around loneliness. They don't try and become friends. They don't try and teach each other to hug and to love and to feel and know. They sort of foment these feelings and they go, this is why we should hate women and this is why we should hate the government.
When you find other people who are suffering what you're suffering or who get you, it's incredibly compelling and you feel seen and you feel understood. And the work of Dia Khan, the British documentarian, she talks about this, whether you're talking about white supremacists or we're talking about jihadis, they are not driven by hate, they are driven by love. And this is what we don't understand, which is it's people who are missing love, desperately looking for love, and desperately looking for belonging. And in the world today, I think there's been a total loss of idealism.
Yeah.
You know, our leaders used to talk about world peace and peace on earth. You and I having a conversation about world peace right now would sound cheesy and corny and weird. And I think there's been a loss of idealism. And when there's a loss of idealism and something to feel like we belong to larger than ourselves, larger than our nation, larger than the work that we do, if that's missing, we still look for that. We still look for that belonging, but unfortunately we find it down here. And I think we're witnessing the loss of idealism in the world right now, how we're finding community at low levels and tearing each other apart.
All right. So again, going back to this sense of belonging, I'm just going to pause right here for a second and see if there was any questions, Krista, in the chat that people had about what I've presented so far.
No specific questions, but just comments on the different content. And it's really interesting because I also I had a visceral sensation when the tape video started playing. And so I really had to check my bias and just listen, because it wasn't that we were promoting any sort of messaging here. It is we are trying to get this understanding of what is driving people to these extremist type groups. So
Exactly.
is that kind of capturing what people are saying in the comments? Is that making sense? Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. All right. Well, I'm going to kind of segue a little bit. This last piece that you just watched, the last video, again, it highlighted that there's this lack of sense of belonging, and that I thought it was super interesting that these young men were joining these online groups and finding a sense of belonging with other young men who identified as not belonging anywhere. So they created an in-group of themselves, and the in-group was based around the idea that they didn't belong anywhere, that they were antisocial, that they weren't part of anything else. So I think the drive to belong somewhere is so strong that sometimes people even create a sense of belonging around the idea that you don't belong. And that's what that video was highlighting. So let's talk a little bit about in-groups and out-groups, because it's a really important piece to consider when you're looking at this material. So when in-groups form, they tend to foster a sense of exclusivity and solidarity inside their ranks. And I'm going to go back to the Minnesota Nice and the lovely women that I knew who had their own in-groups in the little town that I lived in. And they would spend time inside those in-groups, and they felt very safe in them. They felt, they felt connected to them. It was a very good experience for them. But what happens when you have a group that has an in-group is that there are always those who are on the outside of that group. And those in the out-group feel very alienated. And especially if they hold differing views or identities. And I'm going to go back to this idea of neurodiversity. If you're neurodiverse and you're living in a society that has what people call neuronormative behaviors, you're always feeling on the out group because you don't match the behaviors that have been normalized in that culture. And the in-group also tends to start to fear those who don't fit into their group because they're so comfortable in their in-group. They fear what others will do to that group. They fear how they might change it. They fear how they might challenge some of their beliefs. They fear that they might lose that closeness that they have, that sense of belonging. And so when you have these dynamics happening of in-groups and out-groups, and when they're really strong, you start to see a lot of polarization. You start to see a deepening of the divide and a mistrust amongst these communities. And what this does is it distracts from more pressing systemic issues. So groups start to turn on one another instead of dealing with a systemic issue like economic inequality or social injustice. They start to look at the other group as the problem instead of saying, how might we change our culture? For instance, how might we become turn Minnesota or Midwest nice into something deeper that includes out-group people? When these in-groups and out-groups get that strong and when they start turning on each other, it really makes it easy for external forces to exert influence. And by external forces, I mean groups that want to take control of things, that want power. And one of the ways they do this is to use rhetoric. And the rhetoric really is designed to emphasize in-group and out-group dynamics that really highlights how these groups are different. And sometimes the rhetoric doesn't seem all that bad, and we'll talk about a few of the rhetoric the examples I've got in a minute. But it really highlights the difference between the groups, and it really emphasizes that these two groups should not like each other. Rhetoric is often aimed at vulnerable people who are in a position where they are feeling like they maybe are on the outside, or they don't have a strong sense of belonging, or when they're feeling they're part of an in-group, because it can happen to both places, where they're part of an in-group and they're afraid of losing what they have. So rhetoric works really well in both out-groups and in-groups to create more division. So I wanted to give you an example of how this is working in a real situation, and I decided to go to Myanmar, which is in Asia. And in a couple of years ago, 2017 or so, it had a huge influx of Rohingya, I can't say the word, sorry, refugees. They're a Muslim group that lives in Bangladesh and in Myanmar. And they were flooding into Myanmar, and the country, Myanmar, was largely a Buddhist population. And Buddhism, I always experienced it as a very peaceful religion, one that accepts people and tolerates all people. But what we found in Myanmar was that this in-group of the Buddhist population was starting to really react in very aggressive ways towards the Rohingya refugees. And there were the refugees their villages were being burned, and there was images of them fleeing these villages in 2017. The refugees were reporting stories of mass shootings, machete attacks, and rapes by both security forces and civilians. And there was a Myanmar monk, Buddhist monk, who was using a lot of rhetoric to reinforce the in-group, out-group tension and divide. For example, one of the things he said is a woman is better to marry a dog. She's better off if she marries a dog than a Muslim. So, that's pretty inflammatory language, but he was saying these things and couching them in terms of sort of this in-group idea of we're under attack and we need to protect ourselves. So this article talks about sort of these hate speech narratives that he was tapping into. And there's this sort of meta narrative that this priest or this monk was using in this conflict between the Buddhists and the Muslim refugees that were coming to that community. And the rhetoric included things about how non-Buddhists threatened the community, how there were violent foreign religions coming in trying to take over, Myanmar, that women needed to be protected, although they don't really define which women needed to be protected, but it was probably the Buddhist women. They talked about how military strength is essential. They talked about biased and misinformed international community. They just don't understand what's going on in here. They can't see the violence that these foreigners are bringing here. And they talked about race traders and foreign agents causing problems and that they were dangerous to the sanctity and security of their nation. So you can see this sort of meta narrative, some of which sounds, military strength is, we want to protect our national borders. That doesn't sound bad. We want to protect women. That doesn't sound bad. But this meta narrative was all geared towards this in-group, out-group dynamic that really set up a division between the two groups in Myanmar. So I wanted to give that as a concrete example of how rhetoric and hate speech drives the alienation process. But I also want to move away from this idea that those people, the in-group people who are using this hate speech, were not being harmed by it in the process of using it. A lot of times when we hear people, like some people felt when they heard Tate talk, we want to be angry at them and we want to say, they're wrong, they're bad. If they only changed, everything would be good. But the problem is when a person chooses to align with a community of hate, it's very self-destructive. And it often rises out of fear the individual has of not belonging or of losing something that's really important to them, of losing belonging, a sense of belonging. And the more they fear, the more they build that hate rooted in that fear. And I think what we tend to do a lot of times is we want to blame who are essentially victims. We want to say these people who are hating, they're to blame, and we just are going to hate them back. But that doesn't solve the dynamic, because actually the haters are also victims. And when we start to talk about compassion and thinking about others, we often want to be compassionate to those we feel friendly towards or caring towards. So it's really easy to feel compassion towards someone you love, or a child in the community who's been suffering, or people being driven from the village by people with machetes. It's much more difficult to have compassion to those who are expressing hate that has risen out of a fear. And that's a really difficult dynamic for us to do. And we're going to talk about that a little more as we go on. But I want you to remember that hate often is the memory of a violence perpetuated by another person who invalidated their personhood. In other words, a lot of times this hate is coming out of a sense of being isolated, lonely, and disconnected from a community, a sense of not belonging. Hate is a trauma response. And so if we want to really get at what's dividing us, we have to stop seeing hate as a behavior that is evil and start seeing it as a trauma response. Now, I also hear a lot from community members that people just naturally hate. We've done it all our lives, all of human history. We've hated other people, we've harmed other people, and human beings are lost because we just naturally hate and divide ourselves. But I don't know that I agree with that. I don't think hate and division are human nature. I think, in fact, the opposite is true. I think hate and division are fomented. They are created and pushed by people who thrive on extreme polarization, by people who are really trying to divide us because it gains them power. So who benefits from hate, fear, and division? Well, people who make money from it, people who gain power from it, and people who have popular positions and want their positions to be in a stronger position, they benefit when we are divided. So immense power and money await for those who are able to really mobilize people using rhetoric, the rhetoric of fear and hate. So what do we do about it? Well, I'm going to get to that in a second, but I wanted to check in with Krista and see if there was any questions.
Yes, I have to scroll up to find them because we've got a lot going on in the comments.
Good. People are thinking then.
Some people are asking about what to do, which it sounds like we're going to talk about that here soon. I guess I'm curious, have you stumbled upon any studies that people recognize, like when they join a hate group, do they recognize it as a hate group, or is there other things and then like the hate kind of boils up and they're like, oh, maybe I am connected because of this, but I didn't identify it as a hate group when I first joined?
Yeah, and I didn't put in this presentation, so I'll talk about it real briefly, this idea of concentric circles, right? So when groups like this start, the hate groups start, they have an inner core of people who have these belief systems, and they're usually very unpopular belief systems. I meant to add this, so thank you for bringing this question up. So this inner group has this unpopular core of beliefs, and they want others to follow them. And they tap into discontent that other people have, fears other people have, this sense of lack of belonging that other people have. And you don't move somebody who's not in that inner core group into the core immediately. That doesn't work. People don't just immediately start to join a group and start hating. They tend to get drawn to a group because they see things about the group that they like. And so there's these concentric rings around the inner core that radiate out with messaging that tracks people to it. And people will start with sort of usually benign messaging about, do you feel disconnected? We'll help you out. Do you need a place to go? We can provide you, do you feel lonely? We can be there for you. And they start on the outer rings. And then as they're drawn more and more into it, they become more and more involved in that inner core ideology of hate. So they don't usually start out joining the groups thinking of hate. They start out joining the groups thinking of love and belonging. Just like that video said, the guy said, jihad groups and hate groups, they don't come together and do bad things because they hate. They come together and do bad things because they love their inner group so much, because they feel such a sense of belonging to that inner group. They feel like their survival hinges on hating others and doing atrocious things to others. So people are drawn into these hate groups not by being told what the inner core of the hate group is about, but by hearing messaging that resonates with them. Let's go back to Tate. A young man listening to that didn't hear this message of hate about women. He heard honoring women and how women can be with their men, and he's on the outer ring and just feeling comfortable there. And then as he's drawn further and further in, then the true messages about hating women start to come out. So hopefully that answered that question. I'm going to go on and do some little bit about what do we do about it. So research indicates that the divisiveness will continue to grow if fear of the other and the wounds fueling the fear are not addressed. So we know how these hate groups work. We know what draws people into them. We know what will stop them. We know that if somebody is deeply embedded inside of a hate group, you cannot tell them not to be in that. When you argue with them, when you tell them that they're wrong, you just entrench them further into that. What they need to draw them out of there is they need to feel a sense of belonging elsewhere. So for those of you who maybe have family members or friends who've gone down the tunnel hole of some of these groups these days, when you argue with them, you drive them further into the group. But when you invite them into your life, when you really, truly help them feel connected to you, when you show them love and compassion, you pull them out of the group. It is an incredibly difficult thing to do, which is why we have the problem we have today. So what I'm talking about is compassion. And going back to Jeff Cohen, who was at the very beginning of this presentation, he suggests that we need to look past these ideologies and focus on our commonalities. So if you have friends or families who are embedded in some of these ideologies, you need to focus on how you can be with them and connect to them in ways that you are connected. We need to embrace what being human is together, and we need to accept them and show them respect, even if we don't agree with their ideas. So the research suggests also that compassion is what is natural for human beings, that humans are naturally compassionate. And that in fact, it is part of our human survival. Rather than hate-filled, humans tend to seek compassion and seek being with each other and want to love. And so we need to amplify that, not messages of hate. But how do we describe compassion? So this is one way of thinking about compassion. And it breaks compassion down into 4 components. One component, because the idea is that we can build our compassion and we can get better at building other people's compassion. So one component of compassion is cognitive, and that's simply the awareness of suffering. Now, for those of you who've experienced suffering, or know people who've experienced suffering, you know that sometimes out of that suffering, people grow more compassionate. They don't want to see other people suffer like they have, but sometimes they go the other direction. And so what's the difference between somebody who has experienced suffering, harm, violence against them, loneliness? What's the difference between them seeking to be more compassionate and them seeking and instead, or turning the other way and seeking to be more hate-filled? And I think it probably has to do with who they connect with, where they get a sense of belonging. Another component of compassion is the affective component. So you have to build your sympathetic concern about suffering. You have to be emotionally moved by suffering. And we've heard of people who kind of sealed off their emotions and don't get moved by, and the harm that causes them when they're no longer moved by other people's suffering. And some of our first responders in the community, for instance, start to seal off their emotions. They're no longer, it's a survival instinct, right? They're no longer being affected by the suffering they're seeing around us because they can't handle it. So they seal off their emotions. But what that does is it seals them away from compassion. So how do they survive in an environment where they're seeing a lot of suffering, but not seal away their compassion? And that is a challenge that we have to think about. There's also an intentional component. People have to choose that they don't want to see people suffer. They have to choose to want to ease the suffering of others. And there are people who choose not to do that. And finally, there's a motivational component where they have to be ready and responsive to that suffering. They actually have to take action in the community to end suffering. So compassion isn't just the sense of I want to help. Compassion is also all these other components. So if we go back to, say, a family member who's gone down the rabbit hole and is involved in a hate group, you know, you need to when you're thinking about them and you want to engage compassion, you have to be aware of their suffering. Why are they moving that way? You have to hear them and what they're suffering, what this hate is covering up, the suffering this hate is covering up. You have to be moved by their suffering. You can't help them if you're angry at them all the time. You actually have to be sorry that they're experiencing the suffering that's causing them to hate so much. You have to want to ease their suffering and you have to do something about it. So that's how that would work. So there's a couple of ways you can cultivate your own compassion. And the first thing you have to do is develop your own self-awareness. What hates or fears do you carry? What trauma do you have? We all know that sometimes we're triggered by trauma. So what trauma do you have that might might cause you to see somebody in a different way and not be open to compassion to them? What are your cultural assumptions? What are your in-group beliefs? And how are you creating a sense of non-belonging to other people? What do you believe? When a lot of us aren't very self-aware, so developing our own self-awareness is part of that. And then we have to, after we've developed our own self-awareness, develop our awareness of others. We have to listen to people actively. We have to hear their perspectives. We have to be comfortable enough with them to invite them in so they feel a sense of belonging with us. And that's hard when we don't understand them. So I'm even thinking of, learning about others who aren't necessarily in hate groups or anything, but are just different than us, culturally different. How do we learn about other people? How do we hear their perspectives? And a lot of times when we're trying to hear other people's perspectives, we end up centering ourselves in the conversation. So somebody will start talking about their particular perspective of what happened, like Andrew Tate was talking, and people immediately started to get their own elevation. They were triggered. They started reacting to what he was saying. They started getting irritated with him. And as Krista said, you have to put some of that aside and just hear what that person is saying in order to understand them and to understand what's driving them. Now, that doesn't mean you have to agree with it. You don't have to like it. You don't have to tell them why you don't like it. You just have to hear it because you want to understand their experience, even if you don't agree with it. So I'm going to do a little exercise with you. I'm going to show another video, and on paper, I just want you to make a mark while the person is talking. Every time you start to think about yourself or think about how you don't agree with them or think about what they're saying and not stop listening to what they're saying, start thinking about something else related, but not hearing what they're saying, just make a little mark. We're not going to share these, obviously, but I think this is a good self-awareness activity on how much are we actually listening. And I guarantee you all of us will start thinking about ourselves during this. So try to be really honest with yourself as you're doing this. I'm probably going to get another annoying ad. Hopefully not. Nope, we did not this time.
My father's early experience of, basically watching his parents die because they were not allowed to go to the hospital because there were no hospitals for Black people. The trauma from that, my father being left an orphan with his younger brother, had a huge impact on him and then consequently on me. That was one of the earliest experiences connected to my father. The next would be my experience of being a part of the Operation Exodus program and being bused. There were only 20 of us that went to this particular school. Being in a Black community, and then suddenly you're plucked out of that and you're on this yellow bus and it rocks up to this school where everybody in the school is white. And suddenly I became an other. And so I was often accused of cheating. I was often shamed in front of the class. I experienced just repeated incidents, and my sister, who's a couple of years older than me, experienced even more. My brother, Saladin, was assigned to High Park High. There were everyday protests, and people, white folk, men, women, children, standing along the side of the road, swearing, throwing rocks, and the kids having to go through that every single day was extremely traumatizing for them. My sister-in-law tells a story of being on the bus and sitting next to a girl when a brick came through the window, and the glass hit the girl in the eye, and there was a real fear, as blood streaming down. She's traumatized watching this. That was the kind of thing that the students face every day on their way to school and coming back home. So there were white students who were actually attending the school. They did come.
Okay, I'm going to stop just because we're getting short on time. So some of the things that I noticed when I listened to that is, when she talks about being accused of cheating, I think to myself, well, I get accused of cheating. That is maybe a inner voice that might pop up in your head. I also have gotten accused of cheating, or I also am traumatized. That's some of the ways in which we often don't hear people and instead center ourselves in the conversation. Also, when she was talking, what I noticed in particular this time, I've listened to it several times, is she talks about the trauma that she walked away with from that experience and how that trauma lingers with her and how it probably impacts her experience of working with people who traumatized her, the people who traumatized her, in this case, white people. Every day she probably has to revisit that maybe even subconsciously, some of those memories. So unfortunately, I don't have time for the last activity, which is here. I'm just going to walk through it real quickly. You can do it on your own, but think about moving to a new culture community with a cultural belief system, which is very different than your own, that you've lost contact with all your old friends and families, that you have to work in this new environment, but you don't understand all the rules. And if you don't do well in this environment, the consequences could be severe. You could be homeless or not eat. What would you miss about your old community? What would hinder your ability to be successful in your new community? What could those in the community do to help you? And how might you experience loneliness in this community? This is an exercise you can take home for yourselves. And I just want to say compassion is beauty, and thank you for listening to me today.
You're still spotlit, but when you unshared your screen, we got lots of hearts and claps.
Oh, wonderful.
Really sweet. Usually I don't get to see all of the background stuff. Do we have any questions? Lots of great presentations. I love this exercise at the very end. I've never seen compassion done in this sense of just listening to a story and then like tallying every time that you think of yourself and your own needs. Like that is so powerful, and I will definitely be recommending that we do this within our own organization because I've never seen it done that way. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
People are saying lots of great examples. They feel like they have a better understanding of it.
Part two. Part two.
Part two, yeah. Somebody
Yeah.
mentioned this could be its
There
own.
is a lot to talk about. Yeah, you can go deeper inside of all this. I mean, I covered a lot of different concepts in a little short time, and I just skimmed them all.
Yeah, for sure. Have you heard of the Dunning-Kruger effect? Basically,
Mm,
humans, like, we are really good at recognizing faults in others or like a lack of skill in others, but we cannot apply it to ourselves. And I've seen some recent studies talking about how we all think that we're really good at like recognizing propaganda, but in reality, like we're all very susceptible to it and we can't necessarily actually recognize it. And I think it's kind of tied to that little bit of a concept. So um, I guess, do you have any recommendations for, we like to put together additional resources, and I like to think of them as kind of breadcrumbs for people that are really interested in the topic. I have concentric circles written down. Is there anything else that you would like to see in these additional resources?
well, I think in the PowerPoint, and I can give you the links, Krista, so you can put them into but in the PowerPoint are all the links that of some of the stories I went to, so I can share those. I'll see if I can find a concentric circle, good summary of that. I can just put together some more resources if you give me a few days, because I got a grant due this weekend or this week, so it'll have to be after that. But yeah, I'd be happy to do that.
Actually, if you want, I'll put together the resources and I'm going to share them with you before I share them with the group. And then if you could let me know what else we need to be adding in there, that would be
that would be fine. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Renee. Wonderful, wonderful presentation. Please take a moment to fill out our evaluation survey. And yeah, this has been such a fun collab. Renee mentioned that we met each other through UND's public administration program. Renee was one of my favorite professors. We're not supposed to have favorites, but I'm out of that.
Thank you.
Now, so I have to say that. Well,
Can
thank
you
you all
save
so
the chat for me, because I didn't get a chance to read all the chat, and I don't think I can save it.
Yep, we can
Oh, wait,
definitely.
I found a way to save it. Maybe I have it now.
Kyle, can you put the link in for me? The one that I put in isn't working. Thank you.
We've had really not that many issues with iEcho, of course, and we're gonna have issues on like the very, second to last session.
Well, it was fun being here with everybody. It was fun putting this presentation together. When Krista introduced the topic, I said, oh yeah, I can do something on this. And then when I actually went to put together, it was a lot more interesting, and there was just so much that I could have added in. And so it was a lot of fun putting this together. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate the time and care. This was fantastic. Okay, so we have the link in the link to the survey in the chat once again. We did get one really great comment. Okay, I understand feeling lonely in a crowd. I often don't feel like I belong anywhere, especially living in the United States. I miss the sense of home and familiar community, and sometimes it feels like I'm just drifting without roots. Adding to that, I find myself longing for cultural connections and shared experiences that remind me of where I came from, whether it's food, language, or traditions. These little ties make all the difference. At the same time, I'm trying to build new bonds here, seeking out groups and people who share my passions, values, or background. It's a journey, but each small connection helps me feel a little bit more anchored. So, it was a great topic. Thank you.
Yeah, exactly. The way I overcame my loneliness when I was younger is I do a lot of work in the community, and it took me a while to find my community group, but once I found them, then my loneliness started easing because I felt like I belonged somewhere. So sometimes it's trial and error and just keep pushing yourself out there. But we can do a lot more as a community to help people feel connected. So
I'm really thankful for this series because it has actually kind of forced me out of my comfort zone, because I'm starting to feel the creeping sensation of loneliness and a lot of hopelessness, which is always a scary feeling to deal with. And just finding that one place in the community that is almost like a hub to get you to other groups. There's a local bookstore here that shares a lot of information about different community groups, and I've actually joined a handful of those, and I was very uncomfortable with it because I don't consider myself an outgoing person necessarily with like strangers, but it has definitely made a difference, and it's definitely impacted my mental health. So.
And maybe I could also just sort of say that one of the things I do is that Taking Action speaker series. So that might be something where we bring people together and they listen to a topic and then have a little chance to share with an idea of building more community.
Yeah, exactly. Actually, if you want to share the link to that group, it's kind of fun to share some Minnesota resources because most of the series has been based around North Dakota resources. So, and I know we have a handful of Minnesotans in our audience.
I will share a link to the website. It's on the Minnesota Now website because that is our partner. And I will share a link to that website so you can see if you want to join the, Krista's going to be presenting at that in June. So come see her at least. I have to send it to everyone. So here's a link to the web page where you can get more information.
Thank you much. I'll include that in the additional resources as well.
All right.
All right, everybody. I'm going to play a little bit of music, and we'll give everybody a minute to fill out that survey, and then I'll close out the room. So thank you all so much. Thank you again, Renee.
Yep, you're welcome.
Hi, Michelle. All right, everybody. I will give you a